I never thought I'd find myself in this position, sitting on the balcony of our beachfront rental, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, while my heart raced with thoughts that should never cross a daughter-in-law's mind. The salt-laden breeze carried the scent of the ocean, but all I could focus on was the lingering trace of his cologne from when he'd passed by moments earlier. My name is Julie Matthews, and until this vacation, I thought I had the perfect life. At 32, I had a successful career in marketing, a beautiful 4-year-old daughter named Emma, and what I believed to be a rock-solid marriage to my college sweetheart, David. But one week in the Outer Banks would unravel everything I thought I knew about myself. It started innocently enough. David's parents, Robert and Linda, had surprised the whole family with a 2-week vacation rental to celebrate their 35th wedding anniversary. A sprawling beach house with enough room for all of us, David's younger sister Sarah and her husband Tom, his older brother Michael, and our little family. It was meant to be a time of celebration, of family bonding, of creating memories that would last a lifetime. Instead, it became the beginning of my undoing. The first few days were exactly what you'd expect from a family vacation. Lazy mornings spent over coffee and pancakes, afternoons building sandcastles with Emma, and evenings filled with board games and wine. Robert, I had always called him Dad since the wedding, was different here, more relaxed than I'd ever seen him. Gone were the tailored suits he wore at his law firm, replaced by casual linen shirts and shorts that revealed a physique I'd never noticed before. I blamed it on the beach air at first, this strange awareness I suddenly had of him. The way he'd help me prepare dinner in the kitchen, reaching past me for ingredients, his presence solid and sure behind me, the sound of his laugh during evening walks along the shore, deep and genuine in a way David's hadn't been in years. The thoughtful way he listened when I talked about my dreams of starting my own agency someday, something David had dismissed as impractical months ago. It was during one of those sunset walks that something shifted. David had stayed back at the house with Emma, who had a slight fever. The others were engaged in a heated beach volleyball match, their shouts carrying across the sand. Robert and I walked in comfortable silence, the warm water lapping at our feet. "You know," he said, stopping to pick up a perfect spiral shell, "David doesn't know how lucky he is." He handed me the shell, his fingers brushing against my palm, sending an unexpected jolt through my body. "I see how you are with Emma, with the family. You have a light about you, Julie. Sometimes I wonder if my son sees it anymore." I should have changed the subject, should have made a joke about him getting sentimental in his old age. Instead, I looked up and met his eyes so similar to David's, yet somehow warmer, deeper. In that moment, something dangerous flickered between us, something that made my breath catch and my heart stumble. "Dad," I started to say, but the word felt wrong now, laden with an entirely different meaning. He must have sensed it too, because he took a step back, running a hand through his silver-streaked hair, a gesture so familiar it made my chest ache. "We should head back," he said quietly. "Linda will be wondering where we are." That night, lying beside David as he scrolled through his phone, barely acknowledging my presence, I found myself replaying that moment on the beach. The way Robert had looked at me, the way his simple touch had awakened something I thought had died years ago. The worst part wasn't the guilt that followed these thoughts. It was the thrill that accompanied them. Little did I know, that moment on the beach was just the beginning. The next 12 days would test every vow I'd ever made, every belief I held about love, loyalty, and family. And somewhere between the stolen glances and accidental touches, I would discover that the heart doesn't always follow the rules we set for it. The morning after our beach walk, I woke before anyone else. The house was quiet, except for the distant rhythm of waves and the soft whir of the ceiling fan. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake David, though I doubted anything could disturb his heavy sleep. He'd had too many beers the night before, another recent habit I'd been trying to ignore. The kitchen was my sanctuary in the early hours. I was measuring coffee grounds when I heard footsteps on the stairs. My body tensed, somehow knowing it was him before he even entered the room. Robert appeared in the doorway, dressed for his morning run, and for a moment we just looked at each other. I didn't expect anyone else to be up, he said softly, his voice rough with sleep. In the pale morning light, he looked younger somehow, more vulnerable. I couldn't sleep, I admitted, turning back to the coffee maker. Would you like some before your run? He stepped into the kitchen and suddenly the room felt too small. I probably shouldn't. Linda's been warning me about my caffeine intake. He chuckled, but there was something strained in it. Though what she doesn't know won't hurt her, right? The words hung between us, heavy with unintended meaning. I busied myself with mugs and spoons, hyper-aware of his presence behind me. When I turned to hand him his coffee, he was closer than I expected. Our fingers brushed during the exchange, and neither of us pulled away immediately. Julie, he started, then stopped as footsteps creaked overhead. I stepped back quickly, nearly spilling my coffee. Sarah's voice drifted down the stairs, followed by the sound of Emma calling for me. The spell broke, and Robert moved toward the door. Thanks for the coffee, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. I should get that run in before it gets too hot. The day that followed was torture. The family decided to take a boat tour to see the wild horses of the Outer Banks. In the cramped space of the rental boat, it was impossible to avoid proximity. Every time the boat rocked, Robert's shoulder would brush against mine. Every time someone pointed out a horse on the shore, we'd lean in the same direction, our arms touching. David spent most of the trip taking business calls from the bow, despite promising this vacation would be work-free. Emma sat in Linda's lap, squealing with delight at each horse sighting, while Sarah and Tom took endless selfies. Michael was deep in conversation with the boat captain about fishing spots, leaving Robert and me in a bubble of charged silence. "Look at that one!" Robert whispered at one point, his breath warm against my ear as he pointed to a stallion galloping along the shore. His other hand rested on the rail beside mine, our pinky fingers a hair's breadth apart. The urge to close that tiny gap was overwhelming. I pulled my hand away and wrapped my arms around myself, feeling cold despite the summer heat. "Beautiful," I managed to say, though I hadn't really looked at the horse at all. That evening, Linda announced she'd made dinner reservations at an upscale restaurant in town to celebrate Sarah's recent promotion. As everyone dispersed to get ready, I lingered in the kitchen, loading the dishwasher from lunch. "I can help with that," Robert's voice came from behind me. Before I could protest, he was beside me, sleeves rolled up, reaching for a plate. In the confined space between the counter and the island, our bodies moved in an awkward dance of domestic routine. "About this morning," he said quietly, passing me a glass. "I think we need to—" "Don't," I cut him off, my voice barely a whisper. "Please, we can't." "Can't what?" The question was gentle, dangerous. When I didn't respond, he continued, "I see the way he treats you, Julie, the way he takes you for granted. You deserve—" "Stop." I gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. "I'm married to your son. We're family. This isn't— We can't have this conversation." The sound of Emma's footsteps thundering down the stairs saved us from whatever might have been said next. She burst into the kitchen in her favourite princess dress, twirling and demanding attention. Robert stepped away from me, his expression unreadable, as he lifted his granddaughter into his arms. "Look at you, princess! Are you ready for our fancy dinner?" I escaped upstairs, my heart pounding. In the bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. What was I doing? What was I thinking? I had a beautiful daughter, a stable marriage, even if it wasn't perfect. Whose was? Yet here I was, entertaining thoughts that could destroy everything. But as I applied my makeup and slipped into the black dress I'd packed for nice evenings out, I couldn't shake the memory of Robert's words. "You deserve." What did I deserve? And why did I so desperately want to hear the end of that sentence? The restaurant was exactly the kind of upscale coastal establishment you'd expect. All weathered wood and nautical touches with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the ocean. Under different circumstances, I might have appreciated the romantic atmosphere. Instead, it felt like an elaborate trap. Linda had arranged the seating, and either through cruel coincidence or cosmic joke, I found myself directly across from Robert. David sat beside me, already reaching for the wine list, while Emma sat between her grandparents, happily colouring on her kids' menu. "You look beautiful tonight," David said absently, not looking up from the wine selections. It was the kind of automatic compliment that had become his specialty, words without weight, attention without intention. But across the table, I caught Robert's gaze. The way he looked at me, really looked at me, made my skin flush. I took a long sip of water, trying to cool the heat rising in my cheeks. The waiter arrived with bread and took our drink orders. David ordered an expensive bottle of red wine for the table, then immediately returned to checking emails on his phone. Sarah launched into a detailed account of her promotion, but I found myself watching Robert's hands as he helped Emma butter her bread. Those hands that had been so close to mine in the kitchen just hours ago. Julie? Linda's voice snapped me back to reality. I was just telling Sarah about that marketing campaign you handled last month, the one for the Children's Hospital. Oh yes, I started, grateful for the distraction. As I described the project, I felt myself relax slightly. This was safe territory, professional, impersonal. That's impressive, Robert said when I finished. You have a real gift for connecting with people, understanding what moves them. His words seemed innocent enough, but the intensity in his eyes told a different story. Under the table, I felt something brush against my foot. My heart stopped, then started again at double speed. It was just a brief touch, possibly accidental, but it sent electricity through my entire body. I shifted in my seat, but then it happened again, more deliberate this time. David was deep in conversation with Michael about some business venture. Linda was helping Emma cut her chicken. Nobody noticed the silent drama playing out beneath the tablecloth, or the way my voice trembled slightly as I answered Tom's question about local real estate prices. The foot, Robert's foot, stayed there, resting lightly against mine. I knew I should move away. I didn't. More wine, Julie? Robert asked, holding up the bottle. His voice was steady, but I could see the slight shake in his hand as he poured. Thank you, I managed, then added quietly. Dad. The word felt like a lie now, a reminder of all the boundaries we were dangerously close to crossing. He flinched almost imperceptibly at the title, and the foot withdrew. The loss of contact left me feeling strangely bereft. The rest of dinner passed in a blur of forced conversation and avoided glances. When Emma started getting cranky, it was the perfect excuse to leave early. David barely looked up from his phone as I announced we should get her to bed. I'll help you get her to the car, Robert offered, standing up. Linda was deep in conversation with Sarah about wedding venues for Michael's upcoming nuptials, and David was still absorbed in his screen. The night air was thick with humidity as we walked to the parking lot, Emma half asleep in my arms. Robert walked beside us, close enough that our arms brushed occasionally, sending sparks through my skin. Let me take her, he offered as we reached the car. You look tired. The transfer of my sleeping daughter from my arms to his brought us close. Too close. For a moment we were sharing the same breath, our faces inches apart. Emma stirred slightly, mumbling something in her sleep, and we froze. Robert, I whispered, and this time there was no pretense of calling him Dad. His name on my lips felt like crossing a line we couldn't uncross. He carefully placed Emma in her car seat, taking longer than necessary to buckle her in. When he straightened up, his face was in shadow, but I could feel the weight of his gaze. This is dangerous, he said softly, not moving away. I know. My voice was barely audible. If things were different. He reached out, his fingers barely grazing my cheek before dropping away. If I were younger, if you weren't married to my son. But I am, I said, the words tasting bitter, and you're not. The sound of voices approaching made us step apart quickly. David appeared, phone finally put away, fumbling with the car keys. Ready to go? He asked, oblivious to the tension crackling in the air. Emma fell asleep? Yeah, I said, my voice unnaturally high. Your dad helped me get her settled. Thanks, Dad, David said casually, sliding into the driver's seat. I got into the passenger side, careful not to look back at Robert. But in the side mirror, I caught a glimpse of him standing in the parking lot watching us drive away, and the look on his face made my heart crack. Back at the beach house, the evening unfolded in quiet chaos. Emma stirred briefly as I carried her to bed, mumbling incoherent words before settling back into sleep. David followed me upstairs, muttering something about finishing emails before bed. Go ahead, I said softly, I'll be up in a bit. He kissed my forehead absent-mindedly, his focus already on his phone, as he disappeared into the office. Alone, I sat on the edge of Emma's bed, watching her breathe deeply, her tiny chest rising and falling. She looked so peaceful, so untouched by the complications of adult life. Guilt welled up in me like a tide, threatening to overwhelm. What was I doing? What kind of example was I setting, even in thought? I stayed there for a long time, hoping that by sheer force of will I could steady my spiraling emotions. But when I finally left her room, the hallway felt suffocating. I needed air. Slipping out the back door onto the deck, I let the night wrap around me. The waves were barely visible in the moonlight, their steady rhythm a distant echo. The air was cooler now, the earlier humidity replaced by a slight breeze. I took a deep breath, trying to cleanse the lingering tension from dinner, from the parking lot, from everything. Couldn't sleep either. I turned quickly, my pulse spiking as Robert stepped out of the shadows. He leaned against the railing, his face barely illuminated by the light spilling from the house. "Robert, we can't keep." I started, but my voice faltered under the weight of his gaze. "I know," he said, his tone low and resigned. "But you're here and I'm here, and pretending this doesn't exist isn't making it go away." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. "We can't keep doing this," I whispered, more myself than him. "No," he agreed, stepping closer, his voice soft. "But tell me you don't feel it." "Julie, tell me you don't think about it every time you look at me." I wanted to deny it, to put an end to this dangerous game, but the words refused to come. The silence stretched between us, thick and unbearable. I gripped the edge of the railing, my knuckles white, as if holding onto it could keep me grounded, keep me from being swept away by what I knew was coming. "Robert," I finally whispered, my voice trembling, "we're playing with fire." "I know," he said, stepping even closer, his presence overwhelming. "But I've been living in that fire since the moment I realized this wasn't just some passing thought. Since the moment I saw you differently." The words sent a shiver through me, equal parts exhilaration and dread. I turned to face him fully, the moonlight catching the silver in his hair, the lines of his face that had always seemed so composed. Now there was vulnerability there, something raw and exposed. "This isn't fair," I said, barely able to meet his eyes. "Not to David, not to Linda, not to Emma. What we're doing, what we're feeling, is real," he interrupted, his voice firm but laced with anguish. "I know it's wrong, I know it's impossible, but don't tell me it isn't real." Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the sight of him. I hated that he was right. I hated that my heart raced every time he looked at me, that I ached for the moments when we were alone. But most of all, I hated that I couldn't stop. "It doesn't matter if it's real," I said, my voice breaking. "It can't be. We can't let it be." His hand reached out, tentative, brushing against mine on the railing. The touch sent a jolt through me, like every nerve in my body came alive at once. My tears spilled over, and I shook my head, stepping back as his hand fell away. "We have to stop this," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We have to pretend it never happened." He nodded slowly, though his eyes betrayed the turmoil inside. "You're right," he said, his voice rough. "We have to stop." "But pretending it never happened?" "That's a lie we'll never be able to live." I turned away, letting the night swallow my sobs, knowing he was right. I stayed on the deck long after Robert had gone back inside, the chill of the night air doing little to calm the storm raging inside me. The waves crashed against the shore in an endless rhythm, a reminder of how small and fleeting this moment was in the grand scheme of things. Yet it didn't feel small. It felt all-consuming, like it could eclipse everything else. When I finally went back in, the house was dark and quiet. Everyone had gone to bed. I tiptoed up the stairs, pausing outside the door to our room. I could hear David's soft snores through the thin wood, a sound that once brought me comfort, but now made my stomach twist. How had I drifted so far from him? How had I ended up here, standing in the middle of a life that felt both perfect and utterly wrong? I slipped into bed beside him, careful not to wake him. The mattress shifted slightly under my weight, and for a moment I held my breath, waiting for him to stir. He didn't. His phone was still in his hand, screen dark, the battery likely dead. I gently pried it from his fingers and set it on the nightstand. Staring at the ceiling, I replayed the night in my mind, every glance, every word, every touch. The way Robert had looked at me, the raw honesty in his voice, the way my heart had betrayed me, leaping at the idea of him even as my mind screamed to stop. I pressed my palms to my eyes, willing the thoughts away. But they wouldn't leave. They clung to me, whispering possibilities I couldn't afford to entertain. This had to end. I had to end it. Not just for me, but for Emma, for David, for Linda, for the life I'd built and the family I still loved in my own flawed, fractured way. But as I lay there in the darkness, the memory of Robert's touch lingered like a ghost, and I knew the truth. Forgetting wouldn't be enough. What we'd started couldn't be undone. It could only be buried. And I wasn't sure how long I could keep it buried. The next morning, the house was bustling with the sounds of a family trying to make the most of their vacation. Emma's laughter echoed down the hallway as Linda helped her pick out a swimsuit. David was on the phone again, his voice blending into the background noise as he discussed some work crisis. Sarah and Tom debated whether they should rent jet skis or spend the day lounging on the beach. I stayed in the kitchen, busying myself with breakfast preparations. It was easier to focus on the mundane, the sizzle of bacon, the crack of eggshells, than face the reality of my thoughts. The smell of coffee filled the air, warm and comforting, masking the turmoil beneath the surface. Robert entered the room, his presence as noticeable as if he'd shouted. My back was to him, but I felt the tension tighten in the air. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and careful, as if testing the waters. "Morning," I replied without turning, focusing on the skillet in front of me. I couldn't afford to meet his gaze. Not now, not ever. "Can I help with anything?" he asked, stepping closer. "No," I said quickly, a little too sharply. "I've got it." The room fell into silence, broken only by the clatter of a plate as I set it on the counter. His footsteps moved closer until he was standing just behind me, close enough that I could feel his presence but not his touch. "Julie," he said softly, almost a plea. I turned off the burner and gripped the edge of the counter, my knuckles white. "Don't," I whispered. "We can't keep doing this." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with regret, but pretending it didn't happen, pretending I don't feel this way. "We have to," I interrupted, finally turning to face him. His expression was pained, his eyes searching mine for something. Permission, forgiveness, hope. Before either of us could say more, Emma burst into the room, her face lit with excitement. "Grandpa, can you take me to the beach?" she asked, grabbing his hand. "Of course, Princess," he said, his voice steady again, though his eyes lingered on mine for a moment too long. As Emma tugged Robert toward the hallway, I turned back to the counter, gripping the edge so hard my fingers ached. My heart pounded as I forced myself to focus on the mundane task of stacking pancakes, each one a desperate attempt to ground myself in normalcy. The sounds of the family's chatter swirled around me as everyone trickled into the kitchen. David finally hung up his phone and kissed the top of my head. "Smells great, babe," he said, grabbing a plate. His casual affection felt hollow, a pale imitation of what it once was. "Are you coming to the beach?" Linda asked, sitting down at the table with her coffee. "I'll meet you there," I said quickly. "I need to clean up here first." Linda nodded, seeming not to notice the slight tremor in my voice. As everyone finished eating and began gathering their things, I lingered in the kitchen, hoping the distance would give me the space I needed to breathe. But when I finally stepped out onto the deck, the sight of Robert and Emma playing in the surf hit me like a wave. He swung her around in the water, her laughter carrying on the breeze. Linda was on a lounge chair nearby, snapping pictures of them on her phone. David stood with Sarah and Tom, laughing at some joke I couldn't hear. It all looked so perfect, so painfully normal. I sat on a chair under the shade of an umbrella, my book open on my lap, though I couldn't focus on the words. Instead, I watched the scene before me, a hollow ache settling in my chest. Robert glanced up and caught my eye. The smile he wore for Emma faltered just for a moment before he turned back to her. That single second of recognition sent a ripple through me, a reminder that this was far from over, no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise. As I forced myself to look away, Linda walked over and sat beside me. "You've been quiet today," she said, her tone light but probing. "I'm fine," I lied, offering a weak smile. "Just tired." Her eyes lingered on me, knowing and unreadable. "Well, if you ever want to talk, I'm here." I nodded, but her words felt like an unspoken warning. The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of sun and forced smiles. I stayed under the umbrella, pretending to read, while the others played volleyball or waded into the ocean. Emma's laughter floated through the air, an innocent melody in the midst of my storm. Every so often I caught Robert stealing glances in my direction, and each time I forced myself to look away. Linda eventually stood brushing sand from her cover-up. "I'm going to head back and start on dinner," she announced. "Julie, care to join me? I could use a second pair of hands." I hesitated for only a second before nodding. Of course. As we walked back to the house, the sound of the waves faded, replaced by the crunch of sand beneath our feet. Linda walked slightly ahead, her posture relaxed but her silence heavy. I followed, my stomach twisting with the weight of everything unspoken. When we reached the kitchen, she handed me a cutting board and a stack of vegetables. "Can you chop these while I start the marinade?" "Sure," I replied, setting to work. The rhythmic sound of the knife against the board helped steady me, giving me something to focus on besides the tension hanging in the air. Linda worked quietly for a few minutes before speaking. "You've seemed distracted lately." The knife faltered for a moment before I steadied it. "Just tired, I guess," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. She didn't look up from the bowl she was mixing. "It's not like you. You've always been so present, so engaged with everyone." I forced a smile, hoping it didn't look as strained as it felt. "It's nothing, really." Linda set down her whisk and turned to face me. "Julie, I've been a part of this family for almost 40 years. I know when something's off." My heart pounded, but I kept chopping, hoping the motion would mask my unease. She didn't press further, but her eyes lingered on me for a moment too long before she turned back to the counter. "If there's ever anything you need to talk about, you can always come to me." Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Linda's words echoed in my mind as I chopped vegetables with mechanical precision. Her tone had been warm, even kind, but there was no mistaking the weight behind her offer. Whether she suspected something or was simply extending an olive branch, I couldn't tell, and the uncertainty gnawed at me. "Thanks, Linda," I said, keeping my voice light. "I appreciate that." She gave me a small smile before returning to her marinade, but the silence that followed was charged, as if she were waiting for me to say more. I didn't. By the time dinner was ready, the house was alive with the noise of returning beachgoers. Emma burst through the door first, dripping wet and clutching a bucket of shells. "Mummy, look what Grandpa and I found!" "That's wonderful, sweetheart," I said, crouching to examine her treasures. Behind her, Robert walked in, his hair tousled from the sea breeze and his expression unreadable. He caught my eye for a brief second before looking away, and the fleeting glance sent a jolt through me. David entered last, dropping a towel on a chair. "Smells amazing in here. What's on the menu?" "Grilled chicken, roasted vegetables, and a salad," Linda replied, wiping her hands on a towel. "Everyone wash up and get to the table." Dinner was lively, filled with laughter and conversation. David talked about a fishing trip he and Michael were planning, while Sarah teased Tom about his sunburn. Emma proudly displayed her shell collection, narrating how Grandpa had helped her find the biggest one. Through it all, I played the part of the attentive wife and mother, smiling in all the right places, but my thoughts were miles away. Every time Robert spoke, his voice seemed to cut through the noise, grounding me in a way I didn't want to admit. After dinner, as the others moved to the living room for board games, I stayed behind to clear the table. It was an excuse, really, a chance to breathe. "Need help?" I froze, the plate in my hands nearly slipping. Robert stood in the doorway, his expression carefully neutral. "No," I said quickly, "I've got it." But he stepped closer anyway, his presence filling the room. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "Not now," I whispered, glancing toward the living room. "Then when?" His eyes searched mine, and I felt the fragile walls I'd built around my resolve start to crack. "Robert, please," I whispered, my voice barely audible. I set the plate down on the counter, gripping its edge to steady myself. "Not here. Not now." His expression was pained, his hands clenching at his sides as if he were holding himself back. "I can't keep pretending this isn't happening, Julie. Every time I see you, every time we're in the same room, it's like..." "Like what?" I cut him off, my voice sharper than I intended. Like we're standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the ground to give way. His silence was answer enough. I can't do this, I said, shaking my head. I can't destroy my family, your family, for something that can never be. It's not that simple, he said, stepping closer. You know it's not. The distance between us evaporated, and I felt his presence like a physical force. His voice softened, becoming almost a whisper. You think I haven't tried to stop this? You think I haven't spent every sleepless night telling myself to let it go? But then I see you, and it's like nothing else matters, like nothing else could ever matter. I closed my eyes, willing the tears that threatened to spill to stay put. It has to stop, I said, my voice trembling. It has to, Robert, for both of us. Before he could respond, a burst of laughter erupted from the living room, a sharp reminder of the world just beyond the kitchen walls. We both froze, the sound pulling us back to reality. Julie, are you coming? David's voice called out. I took a shaky breath, brushing past Robert as I grabbed a dish towel. Just finishing up, I called back, forcing an even tone. I turned toward him one last time, my eyes meeting his. This ends here, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He held my gaze for a long moment, the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us. Then he nodded, stepping back as if to create the distance we so desperately needed. Good night, Julie, he said softly, his voice heavy with regret. Good night, I replied, watching him disappear down the hallway. The tension in my chest didn't ease as Robert left the kitchen. If anything, it felt worse, like a knot that had been pulled so tight it might never come undone. I stood there for a moment, gripping the counter, trying to compose myself. The sound of laughter and conversation drifted in from the living room, a stark contrast to the storm inside me. I forced myself to join them, pasting a smile on my face as I settled onto the couch beside David. He barely looked up, focused on shuffling cards for the game they'd started. Finally, Sarah teased, handing me a glass of wine. Thought we'd lost you to the kitchen forever. I smiled weakly, sipping the wine even though my stomach churned. Robert sat on the opposite side of the room, his focus on Emma, who was gleefully trying to stack poker chips in a lopsided tower. He laughed when they toppled over, his warmth with her so genuine it made my heart ache even more. The game started, and I did my best to focus, pretending to care about strategy and bluffing. David leaned close once to point out a move I'd missed, his touch light and familiar, but it felt distant, as if it belonged to someone else's life. The night dragged on, each laugh, each glance at Robert, a test of my resolve. By the time Emma was yawning and rubbing her eyes, I leapt at the chance to take her to bed. I'll get her settled, I said quickly, standing up and scooping her into my arms. David nodded distractedly, already deep into a conversation with Michael about their fishing plans for the next day. As I tucked Emma in, her small hand reached for mine. Are you sad, Mommy? She murmured sleepily. The question caught me off guard. Why do you ask that, sweetheart? She shrugged, her eyes already closing. You just look sad sometimes. Tears stung my eyes, but I smiled for her. I'm okay, baby. Go to sleep. I kissed her forehead, but as I closed the door behind me, her words echoed in my mind. Out of the mouths of babes, I thought bitterly. Even my 4-year-old could see through me. When I turned, Robert was at the end of the hallway watching me. Neither of us spoke, but in the silence, everything we couldn't say filled the space between us. For a long moment, Robert and I just stared at each other down the dimly lit hallway, the house silent except for the faint murmur of voices from the living room. My heart pounded in my chest, so loud it felt impossible that he couldn't hear it. You should go back to them, I whispered, my voice barely carrying across the space. His eyes didn't waver. And you? I'll be there soon, I said, though I wasn't sure if it was true. He hesitated, his expression torn between staying and leaving before nodding almost imperceptibly. Without another word, he turned and disappeared down the stairs. I exhaled shakily, leaning against the doorframe for support. What was I doing? What had I already done? I returned to the living room a few minutes later, taking a seat beside David. He gave me a cursory smile before returning his attention to the game, completely oblivious to the storm raging inside me. Across the room, Robert sat next to Linda, his arm draped casually over the back of her chair. From the outside, they looked like the picture-perfect couple, settled, comfortable, untouchable. But I knew better. Linda caught my eye and smiled warmly, gesturing for me to join the conversation she was having with Sarah and Tom. I tried to engage, nodding and adding comments here and there, but my mind kept drifting to the hallway, to Emma's sleepy question, to Robert's unwavering gaze. As the evening wore on, I found myself watching the clock, counting down the minutes until I could escape to the solitude of my room. When the others finally began to drift off to bed, I felt a surge of relief. David stretched and yawned. "You coming up?" "In a minute," I said, keeping my voice steady. "I just need to finish my wine." He nodded and kissed my forehead, oblivious as ever. When the house was quiet again, I stayed on the couch, staring into my empty glass. I told myself I was savouring the peace, but deep down I knew I was waiting, hoping Robert wouldn't come back, terrified he might. The silence of the house was deafening, broken only by the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. I stared into the empty wine glass, turning it slowly in my hands, the weight of my thoughts pressing down on me like a heavy blanket. A floorboard creaked behind me, and my heart leapt into my throat. I didn't need to turn around to know who it was. I felt his presence before he even spoke. "You're still up," Robert said quietly, his voice low and cautious. "So are you," I replied without looking at him. My hands tightened around the glass. He moved further into the room, his footsteps soft against the hardwood. I couldn't sleep. "Me neither," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He sat down in the chair opposite me, leaving a careful distance between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The space between us felt impossibly charged, every unsaid word hanging in the air. "We can't keep doing this," I said finally, my voice trembling. "It's tearing me apart." "I know," he said, his tone filled with regret. "It's tearing me apart too." I glanced up at him, and the look in his eyes nearly broke me. There was so much longing there, so much anguish, that it felt like a mirror to my own heart. I wanted to scream at him, to blame him for all of this, but I couldn't. It wasn't his fault any more than it was mine. We had both walked into this together, blind to where it would lead. "I hate this," I whispered, tears welling in my eyes. "I hate what it's doing to me. To us." "So do I," he said, leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "But I can't make it go away, Julie. Believe me, I've tried." "We have to stop," I said firmly, though my voice cracked on the words. "Before it's too late." He nodded slowly, his expression resigned. "You're right. We have to stop." But as his eyes lingered on mine, the silence between us spoke a different truth. Neither of us knew how. The silence stretched between us, heavy and unrelenting. I could feel the weight of his gaze, the tension pulling us closer despite everything we'd said. My heart screamed at me to get up, to leave the room, to put an end to this madness once and for all. But I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. "I should go," Robert said finally, his voice thick with regret. He leaned back in his chair, his hands clasped together as if holding himself in place. "You should," I agreed softly, though the words felt hollow. He didn't move, neither did I. The truth hung between us, unspoken but undeniable. Even if we stopped now, this wouldn't be the end. "I think about that night," he said, his voice barely audible. "The night we walked on the beach, before all of this felt so impossible, before it became everything I shouldn't want." I closed my eyes, his words cutting through me like a blade. I thought about it too, every day, every night. That moment when everything shifted, when the line between right and wrong blurred into something unrecognizable. "It can't happen again," I whispered, more to myself than to him. "I know," he said, his voice steady but hollow, "but knowing doesn't make it any easier." A lump formed in my throat, the tears threatening to spill over. "You're his father, Robert. His father, and I'm his wife. What we're doing," he interrupted gently, "isn't about hurting them. It's about something we can't control. But you're right, Julie. It has to stop. For them. For us." His words carried the truth we'd been avoiding, but his eyes betrayed the battle he was still fighting. I stood abruptly, needing to put distance between us. "Good night, Robert." He rose slowly, his expression unreadable. "Good night, Julie." As I walked away, I felt his presence like a shadow following me down the hall. The door to my room clicked shut behind me, and I sank onto the bed, my head in my hands. Stopping might have been the right choice, but it felt like it might destroy me anyway. The days that followed were a blur of forced smiles and carefully managed distance. Robert and I avoided each other as much as possible, always staying on opposite sides of the room, ensuring there was no chance of being alone together. The tension was unbearable, a silent weight that pressed down on every interaction. Linda, ever watchful, seemed to notice the change. She didn't say anything outright, but her eyes followed me more closely, her words more measured. It was as if she were daring me to give her a reason to voice what we all knew she suspected. David, on the other hand, remained blissfully unaware, wrapped up in his phone calls and family activities. If he noticed my distraction, he didn't mention it. Perhaps he was too caught up in his own world to see what was unravelling in mine. On the last morning of the trip, I stood on the deck watching the sun rise over the ocean. The soft light painted the waves in shades of gold, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel the peace I'd been chasing all week. The wind tugged at my hair, carrying with it the faint scent of salt and something bittersweet. Freedom, maybe, or regret. Footsteps approached behind me. I didn't need to turn to know it was him. "This is it," Robert said quietly, standing a careful distance away. "The end of this, whatever it is." I nodded, my eyes fixed on the horizon. "It has to be." He stepped closer, just enough that I could feel the warmth of his presence, but not close enough to touch. "In another life." "Maybe," I whispered, a tear slipping down my cheek. "But not this one." The silence between us was thick with everything we couldn't say. Finally, he turned and walked away without another word. I didn't watch him leave. Later that morning, as the cars were packed and the goodbyes exchanged, Robert hugged me briefly, his expression carefully neutral. "Take care, Julie," he said softly. "You too," I replied, my voice steady despite the ache in my chest. As we drove away, the beach house fading in the rearview mirror, I knew the memories of this week would haunt me forever. Some loves aren't meant to be, and some truths are too dangerous to hold on to. We buried it there in the sand and the waves where it belonged, and we would both carry the weight of it for the rest of our lives.